It's incredible when you really think about it, right? Like these belief systems, these invisible structures. I mean, they've moved mountains, literally, shaped civilizations, started wars, inspired incredible acts of, well, everything, really. It's wild how these intangible ideas have had such a real impact.
What's truly captivating is how we can trace those beliefs back,
Oh.
how they first came to be. They don't just appear fully formed, they morph and shift and twist as societies change, as people encounter new ideas, new challenges.
Totally. And that's what we're going to do today in this deep dive. You, dear listener, you send in some fascinating stuff, and we're going to unpack it, pull out those golden nuggets of insight, and hopefully leave you with a few of those aha moments along the way. It's kind of like a fast track to knowledge without having to sift through mountains of information.
And the source you brought us. It takes us straight to the wellspring of belief, exploring some of humanity's earliest forays into the spiritual realm.
You got it. Excerpts from a YouTube video featuring Professor Dr. Kürşat Demirci. The title in Turkish is "En Eski Mabet, Göbekli Tepe'nin Gizemi." Professor Dr. Kürşat Demirci Dozendatiya Tarihi, which means the mystery of the oldest temple, Göbekli Tepe. Professor Dr. Kürşat Demirci History from East to West.
Quite a mouthful, huh? Anyway, we're going to follow along as Professor Demirci takes us through the origins of religious beliefs. We'll explore the mind-blowing significance of Göbekli Tepe, that incredible site. We'll delve into the complex world of ancient Mesopotamian religions, and we might even touch on the beginnings of Judaism and Christianity, all based on what Professor Demirci talks about.
Sounds like a plan.
Okay, so Demirci starts by explaining his field, Dinler Tari. It's a Turkish term. Can you unpack that for us?
Sure. It's essentially religious history, but it's not just listing dates and names. It's history with a focus, specifically on all things religious, using the tools of historical research, but with a lens on beliefs, rituals, how those traditions unfold over time. And he talks about two major approaches, right? The chronological and the comparative.
Hmm.
What's so powerful about the chronological approach? Why is it important?
Well, the chronological method, as you might expect, examines how religious ideas and practices develop over time. But it's more than just a timeline. It's about tracing the life of a belief. Where did it begin? What social and cultural conditions birthed it? How has it evolved over the centuries? And crucially, how did it interact with everything else? Economics, politics, even our inner psychological worlds. You can't just isolate a belief. It's constantly being shaped by its journey through history, like a river carving its path through the landscape.
I get that. Like, you can't really understand the impact of, say, the Renaissance without understanding the centuries of medieval thought that came before.
Right. Makes sense. And then you have the comparative method. How does comparing across different cultures help us understand religious history better? So the comparative method is all about putting religious phenomena side by side. Different cultures, sometimes geographically close, sometimes worlds apart. By comparing, say, Buddhism and ancient Greek mystery cults, or looking at aspects of Judaism and early Islam, we can start to see what's universal, what's unique. It helps us classify and analyze those recurring motifs, see patterns that we might miss when focusing on just one tradition. In the end, you get a richer understanding of each individual tradition by placing it within this larger tapestry of human spirituality.
He also stresses that to truly dig deep, you need help. From fields like archaeology, for instance, and ancient philology, why are these disciplines so vital to understanding religious history?
Especially for ancient religions, yeah. Archaeology provides the tangible stuff, the physical remains. The temples, sacred objects, burial sites. These clues offer a glimpse into their rituals, their beliefs. Things that written texts alone just can't convey. It's like solving a puzzle, and the artifacts are the pieces. And then there's ancient philology, the study of those old languages. It lets us engage directly with the original texts, unlock the meaning behind those beliefs. Grasping the nuances of languages like ancient Greek, Latin, Akkadian, Sumerian, it's like decoding the original message, getting closer to the source.
And what about anthropology? He talks a lot about that. How does it fit in?
Anthropology, it's crucial. It acts as this bridge, linking those tangible archaeological finds with the sometimes very abstract world of belief. It helps us understand the human context behind it all. You can find all the artifacts, decipher every text, but without grasping the people who lived those beliefs, their social structures, daily rituals, worldview, you're missing something essential. Anthropology offers that human perspective, helps us interpret everything within a living, breathing cultural framework.
And he really emphasizes the importance of taking a broad view of history. He uses the rise of Protestantism as an example, saying you can't just focus on the 16th century, you need to zoom out, way out. Why is that long lens so critical?
He argues that to really grasp the emergence of Protestantism, You need to consider a much larger time frame. Go back even a century or more. He points to these seemingly unrelated events like the fall of Constantinople, the Ottoman Empire expanding into Europe, the aftermath of the Crusades, the weakening of the Catholic Church. All these things, in their own complex and indirect ways, contributed to a changing landscape. The authority of the Church weakening, and from that, an environment where new spiritual and intellectual explorations could flourish. It shows how these historical forces influencing religious change, they're rarely simple cause and effect. It's much more nuanced than that.
So, with those tools in our belt, those chronological and comparative methods, and remembering the essential role of archaeology, philology, anthropology, and that broad historical perspective, let's turn to what might be the earliest sign of organized belief: Göbekli Tepe. Professor Demirci mentions Tastepeller, other sites like Göbekli Tepe, and the possibility that they extend beyond just Urfa. What makes Göbekli Tepe so groundbreaking? Why are archaeologists so excited about it?
Göbekli Tepe, along with these other stone hill sites, they've really shaken things up in archaeology.
Yeah.
They've challenged these long-held assumptions. For a long time, the common belief, the one that formed in the early 20th century, was that you needed settled life, agriculture, material development before complex belief systems could arise. The idea was, once society settled down, had surpluses, and they had the luxury to develop abstract ideas, build religious monuments.
So it was civilization first, then religion, but Göbekli Tepe flips that script, right?
Completely. Because Göbekli Tepe, it dates back to the early Neolithic, about
Mm.
10,000 to 8,000 BCE. That's way before widespread agriculture, which means a compelling belief system, whatever it was, might have been the driving force behind people coming together to build these monumental sites, even before they fully embraced farming.
Yeah.
It challenges that whole idea of material needs coming first, and then abstract thought and ritual practice. It suggests, perhaps, that the need to believe, to connect with something bigger than themselves, was even more primal.
And what might those beliefs at Göbekli Tepe have been? Professor Demirci suggests ancestor worship as a possibility. What is ancestor worship?
It's the belief that deceased ancestors, well, they don't just disappear. They continue to exist in some form and can impact the lives of their living descendants, bringing good fortune or misfortune. Professor Demirci explains it might not be the absolute earliest form of belief, but it's certainly ancient and incredibly widespread. You find evidence of it across cultures, throughout history. It's still practiced today in various forms.
He actually gives a really interesting example of this, these Anatolian Sufi traditions, stories about these green turban figures appearing in times of need.
Those narratives, those saintly figures associated with past spiritual leaders intervening in times of crisis, they really illustrate the enduring power of that idea, that those who passed on still have a connection with us can influence the present. It's deeply rooted in so many traditions.
And those iconic T-shaped pillars at Göbekli Tepe, how do they tie in with ancestor worship?
It's a bit of a mystery, but they might be a big clue. Professor Demirci links them to similar standing stones found in later periods, what they call Masabat or Gilgal in the Hebrew Bible. Those later stones were often tied to remembrance, commemoration, maybe even embodying the presence of ancestors. So it's possible those T-shaped pillars, they're stylized human figures, maybe even depictions of ancestors themselves, and they served as focal points for rituals, for remembering, venerating those who came before.
The animal symbols on those pillars, the foxes, snakes, scorpions, spiders, what do they tell us about their beliefs?
Well, those animals might signify a merging of ancestor veneration with a deep reverence for nature. It could be animism, the belief that spirits inhabit nature, existing alongside ancestor worship. These animals, they might have been symbolic to specific groups or clans who gathered at Göbekli Tepe, possibly totems, or ancestral spirits taking animal form. It's this world where the lines between the human, the ancestral, and the natural are all blurred, all interconnected.
And Professor Demirci brings in this really fascinating modern example, the Khasi tribe in India. What do their practices tell us about Göbekli Tepe?
The Khasi people in Jaintia, they still erect massive stones, perform rituals for their ancestors during the solstices. This living tradition is like a window into the past, showing how ancestor veneration can be expressed through these monumental structures and ongoing rituals. It gives us a tangible example of the kind of societal effort and spiritual dedication that must have gone into building and using Göbekli Tepe all those years ago.
Then there's this, well, kind of wild theory linking Göbekli Tepe to sky burials. What's that all about?
It's definitely a more speculative idea, but intriguing nonetheless. Sky burial is the practice of exposing the dead to the elements, letting scavengers, especially birds, take care of the body. And the theory is that those animal depictions on the pillars, the foxes, and maybe vultures implied in other imagery, they represent those scavengers. This practice might have been connected to a belief in a cyclical journey of the soul, where ancestors are brought into the world and then ritually sent off, maybe even toward the heavens, through these animals. Professor Demirci even draws a parallel to ancient Turkic beliefs about leaving the deceased on birch trees and offering to the gods, highlighting maybe those cross-cultural connections in how ancient peoples thought about death, about the afterlife.
He even mentions some pretty unexpected modern echoes of ancestor cults, like the Bakla Harani festival in Istanbul and even April Fool's Day masks. How do those tie in?
Those traditions, as different as they seem, might hold these faint traces, almost echoes, of older ancestral practices. Festivals with masked figures, symbolic reversals like the Bakla Harani or April Fool's Day pranks, maybe they're incredibly distant descendants of rituals meant to connect with, or even appease ancestral spirits. Masks, for instance, could be a way to embody, to temporarily channel other identities, blurring the lines between the living and the dead, but in a ritualized way. It's like finding a whisper, a faint echo of something shouted across millennia. Shows you how ancient beliefs can leave these surprisingly subtle and enduring marks on cultures, even today.
From those potential early stirrings of belief at Göbekli Tepe, let's jump forward. To the religions of ancient Mesopotamia, Professor Demirci really stresses their importance, especially because of their close links to the Hebrew Bible. Why is that connection so significant?
The religions of Mesopotamia, the beliefs and practices of those ancient Sumerians, Akkadians, Babylonians, Assyrians, they're like a crucial ancestor to Western monotheism. They share this deep interwoven history with the traditions that eventually gave rise to the Hebrew Bible, what Christians call the Old Testament. You see parallels in creation narratives, stories of floods, legal principles, all sorts of cultural and religious themes. Understanding Mesopotamian religions gives us this essential context, helps us grasp the origins and development of Judaism, and by extension, Christianity and Islam, like understanding the roots to appreciate the branches.
What are the main sources we have for understanding those ancient Mesopotamian beliefs?
Our understanding mainly comes from two places: cuneiform texts and archaeological discoveries. Cuneiform, that writing system on clay tablets, it left us a treasure trove of information. Myths and legends like the Epic of Gilgamesh, instructions for religious ceremonies, magic spells, prophecies, even guides for sacrifices. And archaeological finds, things like the ruins of ziggurats, those massive temples, statues of their gods, offerings, they provide this amazing visual and material insight into their religious practices, their worldview.
Professor Demirci talks about some key Mesopotamian myths and legends. What's the story behind the Epic of Gilgamesh? Why is it so captivating, even today?
The Epic of Gilgamesh, it's a cornerstone of Mesopotamian literature. It tells the story of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk, who starts out as a tyrant. But then his close friend Enkidu dies. Enkidu represents this wild, untamed side of Gilgamesh, and his death, it forces Gilgamesh to confront his own mortality. Grief-stricken, he embarks on this epic quest to find immortality. It leads him to Utnapishtim, the survivor of a great flood, much like the biblical Noah. Gilgamesh, he almost gets the secret to eternal life, but tragically loses it, snatched away by a serpent. Ultimately, he comes to terms with death, with the value of what he accomplishes in life. Professor Demirci even interprets this journey as a kind of proto-Sufi seru suluk, a spiritual journey of self-discovery. It's this incredibly powerful exploration of universal themes: friendship, loss, fear of death, searching for meaning. And we should remember, the epic, it evolved over time. There are different versions: Old Babylonian, Standard Babylonian, and others. The Standard Babylonian version is the most complete one we have.
And then there's the Enuma Elish, another important myth. What's the core of that creation story?
The Enuma Elish is their creation myth, their Big Bang. It describes this primordial chaos, these epic battles between the gods. In the end, Marduk, the patron god of Babylon, triumphs over Tiamat, this chaotic sea goddess. According to the myths, Marduk then creates the world, humanity, from the remnants of Tiamat. It's their explanation for the origin of everything, humanity's place in the universe. And it held a really central place in Mesopotamian religious thought. Professor Demirci also mentions the Atrahasis epic, another significant myth, particularly because it also includes a detailed flood narrative.
Professor Demirci then focuses on the Sumerians. What makes them so crucial to understanding Mesopotamian religions?
The Sumerians, they flourished in Mesopotamia from around 3500 to 2000 BCE, and they are foundational. They were the first in the region to develop writing, cuneiform, which allowed them to record their laws, history, and importantly, their beliefs. The famous scholar Samuel Noah Kramer, he even said, history begins at Sumer. Those Sumerian records provide the earliest direct evidence of Mesopotamian religious thought. those rituals and myths. There's even debate about their origins. Some theories suggest links to Ural-Altaic languages, which include Proto-Turkic and even Dravidian cultures in India, based on shared vocabulary and certain practices. Those links are still debated, but there's no doubt about the Sumerian influence on later Mesopotamian cultures. They laid the groundwork for so much that followed.
He describes their religion as polytheistic, with this aspect of henotheism. What does that mean, henotheism, in this context?
So the Sumerians and later Mesopotamians, they had this huge pantheon of gods, each with their own specific roles and responsibilities. It was definitely polytheistic. But within that, you see henotheism, which is basically the worship of one god as supreme, without denying the existence of others. In Mesopotamia, while acknowledging many gods, three were often elevated: Anu, the sky god; Enlil, god of storm and the upper world; and Enki, or Ea, god of water and wisdom, seen as the closest to humans, their protector. It's like having a lead actor, but with a very important supporting cast.
Professor Demirci then uses an analogy with Roman religion to explain the Mesopotamian idea of maintaining harmony between the divine and human realms. What are those Roman concepts?
He talks about the Roman ideas of res divinae, divine matters, and res humanae, human affairs, and the Roman goal of achieving pax deorum, peace of the gods. Both the Roman and Mesopotamian systems stressed the importance of maintaining balance between the divine and human. Humans had obligations to the gods through offerings, rituals, worship. Neglecting those duties could lead to divine anger, ira, or agos for the Romans, similar ideas in Mesopotamia. That peace with the gods, it was seen as essential for the well-being of the whole community. If the gods were angry, things could go really bad.
What was their view of the cosmos, their cosmology?
They pictured a flat earth covered by a dome-shaped sky made of these precious materials layered. Anu, the sky god, was believed to reside in the highest layer. They also envisioned a cosmic mountain, Mount Mashu, which acted as an axis mundi, a central pillar connecting the underworld, earth, and the heavens, the place where the divine and mortal realms met.
He talks about the importance of celestial bodies in their beliefs, the moon, the sun, the stars. Which was the most important to them?
Out of all the celestial bodies, the moon, known as Sin or Shem, was paramount. Then came the sun, Shamash or Shems, and lastly, the stars. The moon's importance probably stemmed from its obvious cycles, waxing and waning, governing time, natural rhythms, even human activities. Interestingly, the moon was often associated with the divine masculine, while the sun was seen as feminine. And the moon god, he was a deity of oaths and prophecy, believed to illuminate truth, punish oath breakers. Its cycles also suggested a link to knowledge of the future. Professor Demirci points out the interesting etymological connection between moon and man in some Western languages, a connection that goes way back. They even had temples dedicated to the moon and the sun, like those in Haran and Dera Zafaran. The very name Haran might be connected to the moon's path.
And all that sky watching, what did it lead to?
That constant observation of the heavens was deeply tied to their religion. They looked for omens, trying to interpret the will of the gods through those celestial patterns. And that ultimately led to early forms of astrology, the identification of the zodiac constellations. Professor Demirci links this to the current fascination with apocalyptic predictions and cosmic events, suggesting that those ancient anxieties about our place in the universe, they still resonate with us today. We haven't really escaped them.
Now, shifting gears a bit, Professor Demirci discusses the mother goddess cults that were so widespread in the ancient world. What were the key elements of those beliefs?
Veneration of a mother goddess, it was this really persistent phenomenon in the ancient world. Its roots might even go back to the Paleolithic, before settled agriculture. Those early societies, they might have emphasized female deities because of things like the mysteries of menstruation and childbirth, the perceived connection between women and the fertility of the earth, maybe even a less complete understanding of the male role in reproduction back then. Whatever the reasons, the mother goddess archetype was incredibly powerful.
And he gives some specific examples. Who were some of these mother goddess figures?
Yeah, you see them across different cultures. Kubaba in Phrygia, Cybele, who the Romans linked with their Mater Deum, the Great Mother, and also with the Phrygian Cybele. Then there's the Mesopotamian goddesses Ishtar and Inanna. They're all connected to fertility, the renewal of nature, ease, and childbirth. They embodied the nurturing and life-giving aspects of the divine feminine. So while names and specific attributes varied, that core concept, a powerful life-giving female deity, it was remarkably consistent.
Okay, let's move on to the origins of Judaism. Professor Demirci talks about a progression, Hebrew to Israelite to Jew. Can you explain that?
That's an important distinction to understand Jewish history. The earliest, we call them Hebrews. That term likely emerged around 1800 to 1700 BCE, with Abraham as a central figure. Hebrew might come from the Mesopotamian term Habiru, referring to nomadic or semi-nomadic groups. They lived in southeastern Anatolia, northern Syria, parts of Palestine. Then around 1000 BCE, some of these Hebrew tribes settled in Palestine and formed a kingdom centered in Jerusalem under King David. They became the Israelites. Finally, Jew is a term that arose after the Babylonians destroyed the kingdom of Judah in 586 BCE. That's when the first diaspora began, scattering much of the population.
You mentioned two major diasporas. Can you elaborate on both?
Right. The first diaspora, as I said, happened after the Babylonian conquest in 586 BCE. Many Judeans were exiled to Babylon, in Mesopotamia, which is present-day Iraq. The second diaspora occurred much later, in the 1st and 2nd century CE, after Jewish revolt against Rome. The Roman response was to scatter the remaining Jewish population across the Mediterranean, places like Spain, North Africa, and others. Interestingly, a lot of the practices and institutions of Rabbinic Judaism, things like synagogue worship, they really took shape after that second diaspora, especially since their traditional center in Jerusalem was destroyed.
What's the difference between Jew and Jewish, or Musavi?
Professor Demirci suggests that distinction has become a bit more fluid over time. These days, Musave can include people who converted to Judaism, maybe without those ancestral ties to the Levant. He gives the example of the Khazar Jews. But traditional Rabbinic Judaism has very specific conversion processes. So Jewish might be a broader religious affiliation, while Jew often implies both religious and ancestral connections.
The idea of the Promised Land, Eretz Israel, is central to Jewish identity. When did that concept become so important?
That idea of a divinely promised land, it starts in the book of Genesis, the covenant between God and Abraham. But that concrete yearning for a specific territory, Eretz Israel, it really solidified during and after the first diaspora in the 6th century BCE. Exiled from their homeland, longing to return, the idea of Eretz Israel became a central part of their faith. That longing only intensified after the second diaspora in centuries of displacement.
Professor Demirci briefly talks about Merkaba mysticism and the Dead Sea Scrolls. What are those? Why are they important in early Jewish history?
Merkaba mysticism is an early form of Jewish mystical thought, kind of a precursor to Kabbalah. It emerged in the centuries around the beginning of the Common Era. It focuses on visions of God's throne, the Merkaba, described in the book of Ezekiel. You could see it as similar to early contemplative practices in other religions, like early Sufism. And the Dead Sea Scrolls, those ancient manuscripts found near Qumran by the Dead Sea, they're thought to be from the Essenes, a Jewish sect from that time. They offer a glimpse into the diversity of Jewish beliefs in those centuries before and after Christianity emerged.
Finally, let's talk about Christianity. How did it develop from its Jewish roots?
Christianity came out of Judaism in the 1st century CE. Professor Demirci compares it to how Buddhism emerged from Hinduism, a new tradition arising within an older one, sometimes a new interpretation, sometimes a protest against the old ways. Early Christianity started as a Jewish movement. They believed Jesus of Nazareth was the Messiah. His first followers, they were Jewish, kept Jewish practices while also embracing their belief in Jesus. But over time, their beliefs and practices diverged, becoming a distinct religion, connected to its Jewish roots, but something new.
So, in this deep dive, we've covered a lot of ground. From the mysterious structures at Göbekli Tepe, maybe those earliest flickers of human spirituality, to the complex beliefs and cosmology of ancient Mesopotamia, to the origins of Judaism and how it eventually gave rise to Christianity. It's a massive and intricate story, and one that still has ripples in our world.
It's amazing how these ancient beliefs, they seem so far away, but they've left this lasting legacy. They shape our cultures, our anxieties, even our fundamental questions about life, death, and the universe.
And that leads us to a thought for you, our listener. Think about that deep human need to understand our place in the cosmos, to wrestle with death, with the unknown. How did that need express itself in these different yet sometimes interconnected ancient belief systems? And what echoes do you see in those ancient perspectives compared to today's spiritual, philosophical, even secular worldviews? It's a question worth pondering even after our deep dive ends.
Definitely worth further exploration. If you're interested in learning more, Professor Demirci's writings are a great place to start. Also, some classic works like Samuel Noah Kramer's History Begins at Sumer will give you a deeper look at the primary sources and a richer understanding of those ancient beliefs and their impact.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. Until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, keep exploring.